Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our full day of presentations for Have to Have It, Philadelphians Collect 1850 to 1930. I am Inge Riest. I'm the director of the Center for the History of Collecting at the Frick Collection in New York. So this is a first for me to be welcoming an audience at another museum. And the reason for that is that I've had the great pleasure of working with Jenny Thompson and Greg Stewart to organize this symposium as the first off-site collaboration that our Center for the History of Collecting has undertaken. And it's really been a joy from the very beginning. As you all know, the impetus for this, what gave rise to this symposium, is the stunning exhibition of the collection of John G. Johnson at the museum across the street. And, oh, okay, here you go. Sorry, I usually think I'm booming enough that everybody can hear me anyway, but I apologize. I visited the exhibition yesterday, and I was really just taken by it from the minute I walked in. And I had initially wondered, why is it old masters now? And then I realized, oh, it's very much about now and all of the incredible work that the conservation and curatorial staffs of the museum have been doing over the many years, over the 100 years since Johnson's bequest. It's really impressive, and I'm so glad that the center could play a small part in celebrating this great exhibition. I'm also happy because, as many of you have probably noticed, more and more museums are undertaking exhibitions that focus on collecting, which, given that that's my field of interest, I'm delighted that the focus is not always on stylistic analysis and iconography or the changes that an artist has gone through over the course of his career or her career. And I'm just so pleased that collecting and individual collections are now giving us a chance to look at works of art through a different lens. It doesn't invalidate the other point of view, but it does enrich our experience, I think, and makes us realize that these individuals lived at moments in time when attitudes towards art were different, and yet we always find commonalities because everything is cyclical, and what goes around comes around. And we find the same impulses in collectors sometimes who lived so many years ago. So this is what our 8 speakers will be exploring today. I will be moderating the first 3 presentations, and then Richard Kagan, history professor emeritus from Johns Hopkins University, will be taking on this role in the afternoon. And then he and Jenny and I will have more to say about Philadelphia collectors who weren't covered by the formal presentations this morning and this afternoon, and we will talk about them just in brief, and we'll hope very much that we'll have your contributions to that conversation too. So without further ado now, I will introduce our first speaker, who not surprisingly is Jenny Thompson, who will talk about John G. Johnson. How could we begin any other way? Jenny is the Gloria and Jack Drosdick Curator of European Painting and Sculpture and Curator of the John G. Johnson Collection here at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and she's responsible for this glorious exhibition, as you know. She joined the Philadelphia Museum of Art's Department of European Painting in 1999, and throughout her career, she has played an essential role in implementing the department's mission to interpret, display, and develop the museum's collections of European painting and sculpture, which span from the 13th to the 20th centuries. Jenny earned her MA and PhD at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, and she has curated or co-curated many notable exhibitions at this museum, including Old Masters Now, celebrating the Johnson collection right now, and Discovering the Impressionists, Paul Durand-Ruel and the New Painting in 2015, as well as Van Gogh Up Close and Late Renoir, taking place in 2012 and 2010, respectively. She is responsible for the collections and installations at Philadelphia's Rodin Museum as well, and serves as the head of the European Painting and Sculpture Department at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. This morning, Jenny will give us the context that we need for her in her presentation, John G. Johnson, Lawyer, Collector, and Philadelphian. So please give a warm welcome to Jenny Thompson.
So thank you, Inga. And before we started, I just wanted to say thank you to the Frick Center for the History of Collecting for joining us in Philadelphia and sort of helping us to look very closely at one city and a group of collectors in it. It has been a great pleasure of mine to work with a fabulous team at the Frick, including Inga, Esme, and Samantha. I also wanted to call out my colleagues here at the museum who've assisted in today and are assisting back in the booth, but particularly to call out Greg Stewart, who's done an extraordinary job in overseeing so many details of this. But to begin. In 1917, the New York Times described John G. Johnson as the greatest lawyer in the English-speaking world, probably less known to the general public in proportion to his importance than any other man in the United States. 100 years later, Johnson's extraordinary career and his remarkable art collections still astound. We often describe Johnson in numbers: 168 cases argued before the US Supreme Court, or 1,279 paintings in his collection. But understanding how and why he assembled one of the largest and most diverse European art collections of his day is harder to explicate. Johnson didn't like to be photographed. He shunned fame and public accolades. He left no diaries, and many of his personal papers and legal papers have been lost. My talk today offers a brief overview of Johnson, the lawyer, collector, and Philadelphian, relying on the collection, Johnson's own words, and those of his contemporaries to offer insight into his personality, ambition, and taste. Born in 1841 to a blacksmith and a former schoolteacher, Johnson was educated in Chestnut Hill's Harmony School and the prestigious Central High School in Philadelphia. Upon graduating in 1857, at age 16, he was 2 years younger than most of his peers, Johnson found work as a scrivener, an office boy, whose duties included serving summonses and subpoenas, and somewhat ironically, given his later illegible handwriting, copying out legal papers. In 1863, here's a photograph of Central High School, as it was then in Johnson's day. In 1863, after 2 years of law classes at the University of Pennsylvania, he was admitted to the Philadelphia bar and began to assist his employer, William Judson, in his work as counsel for the Pennsylvania Company for Insurance on Lives and Granting Annuities. It was then the largest trust company in the state and deeply involved in many real estate transactions and mortgages. Today, Johnson is celebrated for his work in corporate law and his defense of companies such as American Tobacco, Standard Oil, the Sugar Trust, the Pennsylvania Railroad. But he equally worked on divorces and wills. He represented charitable organizations and even baseball clubs. He kept, in fact, the Phillies from losing a number of players to the Athletics. But by 1900, practicing in so many areas of law was regarded as old-fashioned. But Johnson moved with ease from one legal arena to another, working simultaneously on multi-million-dollar cases and modest wills, suggesting that he enjoyed the intellectual challenges of working this way. And indeed, it seems likely that he declined reputed offers from Presidents James Garfield and Grover Cleveland to join the Supreme Court, or President McKinley's request that he serve as Attorney General, simply because the prospect of listening to others argue cases would be far less interesting than doing the work himself. But it would also have meant leaving his native city, and worth reminding ourselves that Johnson was thoroughly Philadelphian. He spoke with a local twang, he enjoyed Phillies games, and he made his home on Broad Street in the center of the city. Anecdotes abound of Johnson's moral code, his photographic memory, and his ability to sift through reams of documents to settle on a succinct and often quite practical legal argument. He was not opposed to drama in the courtroom, as colleagues recalled his performance in the 1870 divorce case of Louisa and Leonard Cooker. Quote, "Big, burly, and somewhat baggily dressed, he sat in the chilly draft of an open door with his overcoat wrapped around his legs. He had neglected to have his hair cut, and it hung about his ears and upon his neck like a tawny mane. When he rose to object to a question in cross-examination, he would throw his overcoat upon the floor, shake his head like a young lion, and roar out his objection, end quote. Johnson's legal fees are also legendary. In 1904, he was paid a phenomenal $500,000, that's about $91 million in today's terms, for the Northern Securities case, a case that he in fact lost in the Supreme Court by a vote of 5-4. On another occasion, he tore up a $25,000 check offered as payment for successfully arguing a coal case before the US Supreme Court, saying, "Gentlemen, I only spoke for 15 minutes, and it took 20 minutes to study the case. Write me a check for $5,000. And on one occasion, he also tried to be paid, unsuccessfully as it proved, with a painting. In May 1897, he defended H.O. Havemeyer, president of the Sugar Trust, for refusing to answer questions of a Senate investigating committee concerning the Sugar Trust's political contributions. Johnson reportedly asked for $3,000 plus an unidentified painting from Havemeyer's collection as his fee for winning the case. Havemeyer refused to part with a painting and instead wrote Johnson a check for $100,000. We don't know what that painting is. I would love to know what Johnson was eyeing in Havemeyer's collection. Despite, or maybe because of, these idiosyncrasies, Johnson's reputation as a lawyer was a national one, and his contemporaries regarded him as leading the bar of the nation. On July 15, 1875, Johnson married Ida Powell Morell, a widow with 3 children. A member of the distinguished Powell family, she was the daughter of John Hare Powell, Ida grew up at Powelton, a Greek revival house that gave its name to a West Philadelphia neighborhood, and she summered in her family's Italianate mansion in Newport. Her social circle was notably different from Johnson's and greatly expanded his connections. Shortly after their marriage, Johnson joined the Distinguished Philadelphia Club and began to attend balls, receptions, and coaching parties in Philadelphia, New York, and Newport. Despite his professed unease in society, the Johnsons hosted dinners and welcomed visiting dignitaries, such as Alice Roosevelt, President Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, Ambassador Speck von Sternberg of Germany, and the novelist Henry James. Ida's effect on Johnson was positive. One family friend recounted that the lawyer, quote, would come rumbling and snorting home from the office and dissolve at once into chuckles, jokes, and horseplay of all kinds. Mrs. Johnson, however, kept him in bounds, end quote. Together, the Johnsons traveled to Europe most summers, relaxing in mountain resorts and visiting museums and galleries in major cities. And I'm showing you one of 7 travel albums that Johnson assembled after these trips. These were from essentially purchased postcards of great paintings he'd seen and admired, and of places they visited. This one in particular, Johnson assembled as a Christmas present for Ida, and it has a nice inscription at the front saying, "To Ida in remembrance of a most happy summer." And I think actually this is Johnson I'm getting ahead of myself. He's actually identified, it's his handwriting that's identifying each of these sites. Although Ida was the daughter of a collector and grew up surrounded by French bronze and old master paintings, there's little evidence that she played a direct role in the formation of the art collection. It was through Ida, however, that Johnson acquired the first paintings in the collection, 3 works seen here from John Hare Powell's collection. And you can, this sort of Madonna, Virgin and Child, you can actually see in one of the first views we have of his house. It's hanging right here on the wall. Precisely what sparked Johnson's interest in art is unknown. Perhaps it was linked to the drawing courses and art curriculum designed by Rembrandt Peale that was required of all Central High School students, or maybe it was the influence of 2 of the largest art displays yet mounted in the United States, the Great Central Sanitary Fair of 1864 and the 1876 Centennial Exposition. At the Sanitary Fair, about which you'll hear more from Kathy Foster and about which Lily Milroy has written so well, contained over 1,000 paintings, sculptures, and watercolors lent by collectors William Wilstack, James Klanghorn, Henry Gibson, Anthony Drexel, Adolphe Bory, and many others. We have no evidence that Johnson attended the fair in Logan Square, but with 400,000 visitors in a 3-week period, it's hard to imagine he didn't. We do know that Johnson attended the Centennial Exposition in Fairmount Park a dozen years later, since he purchased Charles Leblanc's 14-volume History of Paintings from the Goupil Gallery stand, the beginning of what would grow to be almost a 3,000-volume art library. While much remains to be learned about the development of Johnson's collection, his earliest acquisitions in the 1870s and early 1880s were contemporary paintings with historical or sentimental subjects, such as artist Jean Barrault, this is one he sold, Ludovico Marchetti, Francesco Pradilla, or Alfred Stevens. Johnson let 41 works to an 1885 Union League exhibition in Philadelphia, and the following year began to weed out the collection. The critic Roger Fry recalled that Johnson always spoke of this beginning period of his artistic development with a certain deprecating and humorous candor. He had the courage and simplicity to admit the imperfections of his taste and to scrap his whole collection with a financial loss, which warned him that bad art might also be bad speculation. Johnson exchanged many of these earliest purchases for more expensive and daring pieces by, among them, this is a view of that earlier collection. But among the works that he exchanged, he started to acquire much more expensive things, such as this Edward Charlemont painting. He had to exchange 7 paintings and pay more than $5,000 in cash to acquire this piece in 1887. He acquired these 2 Puvis, also through an exchange of works in 1888, and started to buy the Impressionists in the early 1890s. He engaged the American painter Alexander Harrison, a fellow Chestnut Hill native, to help him acquire paintings directly from artists. This painting by the Danish artist Peter Krøyer was commissioned by Harrison on Johnson's behalf. Johnson seems to have left the choice of subject matter to Harrison and Krøyer and was delighted with the painting when it arrived in Philadelphia 2 years later. "The Krøyer is admirable all in all," he wrote. "It is the best picture you have as yet sent me." And Harrison helped Johnson with at least 7 other acquisitions, including a Rodin marble and paintings by Raphael Collin, Santiago Roussillon, and Victor Johansen. In 1883, perhaps because of this growing art collection, the Johnsons moved into a larger house on Broad Street. And by 1892, Johnson was widely recognized as a leading collector in the United States. That year, he produced 2 publications, probably, I think, entirely on his own. A catalog of the 281 paintings then in his collection, and a 44-page memoir describing the exhibitions and museums he had seen in Europe the previous summer. Both publications reveal a strong bias towards the art of his day, with sightseeing in Berlin and Holland among pictures, the travel memoir, revealing a breadth of art historical knowledge. In it, Johnson's confidence sometimes borders on arrogance in statements like, "The great defect of the old Dutchmen is their lack of variety in subject and of mood, of poetical feeling, of imagination, of general knowledge. They leave us as they find us. They never elevate." One wonders if Johnson lived to regret such comments, since he never published any further art commentary, and within a few years, he almost entirely ceased buying 19th century painting. Johnson's belief that art is not of one century only, art is many-sided and of many ages and many men, may have contributed to the change of heart he had after 1892, when he began buying older works in earnest, more than doubling the size of the collection, so that by 1902, he was said to own more than 650 works. This is a view of his house at 506. He lived there from 83 to 1915, but we think this photograph is taken about 1905. In 1893, he acquired the first of 12 paintings by Jan Steen, followed swiftly by an extraordinary Jan van Eyck panel in 1894, and paintings by Veronese and Peter Paul Rubens. His Netherlandish, Dutch, and Flemish works would eventually number some 400 objects, more than double that of his 19th century paintings. But this shift in taste was far from perfunctory, since Johnson bought widely and in depth, acquiring 9 Hieronymus Bosches, 10 Rembrandts, and 9 Jacob van Ruysdaels. His desire for a study collection, rather than a group of choice, trophy-like masterpieces, was noted by P.A.B. Widener's grandson. Quote, "Grandfather wanted only the finest works of an individual artist. Mr. Johnson bought a picture because some one feature of it appealed to him. The Johnson collection contains numerous pictures by the same artist, which Johnson bought simply because the color of a skirt or the turn of a hand appealed to him." Johnson was equally astute and prolific in his acquisition of Italian art, acquiring over 450 works, mainly between the years 1903 and 1917. He acquired, for example, this Callisto Piazza in 1907 from Thomas Agnew and Sons, a Pietro Lorenzetti around 1909 from Langton Douglas, a fragment of Duccio's Maesta via Herbert Horn in 1910. His collection of Italian primitives was not the first in the United States. James Jackson Jarvis preceded him by about 40 years, but Johnson led the way in his generation for early Netherlandish, German, and even Catalan paintings. In each of these areas, Johnson acquired a broad repertoire of famous and lesser-known artists, assisted by a growing team of dealers and art historians, such as Bernard Berenson, Langton Douglas, Roger Fry, Herbert Horn, Mason Perkins, Oswald Siren, and Wilhelm Valentiner, all of whom advised him on purchases and attributions and provided some of the closest friendships of his later years. Johnson's relationship with Berenson, whom he first met in Philadelphia in January 1904, has been explored by Carl Strelke, who's noted that Johnson relied on Berenson, Horn, Fry, and others to bring paintings to his attention and advise him on attributions, though Johnson never depended on one advisor exclusively. Correspondence, receipts, and contemporary accounts all indicate that Johnson formed the collection through contact with more than 50 dealers and galleries in America, Britain, and Europe. And as a little teaser, I'll let you know that we've scanned about 12,000 of those receipts and other archival material that are going to be in a Johnson Collection digital publication that's coming in February 2018. So we'll all have a chance to kind of dig into those receipts and learn more. Johnson's love of the picture hunt was described by a reporter in 1912. If you accidentally meet John G. Johnson of Philadelphia, for instance, in Europe during the summer months, he will not thank you for making the fact known. With his air of a benevolent retired ironmonger, he passes quietly from shop to shop, from one obscure church in a little town to another, and no one suspects his fell intent. In the mid-1890s, as Johnson's collection was expanding rapidly in quantity, geographical range, and date, he was simultaneously creating another painting collection in Philadelphia. As Fairmount Park Commissioner from 1895 to 1917, Johnson administered the Willstack collection, acquiring about 7 works a year using funds left by William and Anna Willstack, whose fortune had been made during the Civil War in saddlery and carriage hardware. Willstack Gallery purchases under Johnson's leadership were judicial and ecumenically balanced American and European painting, but they were far from staid and predictable. In 1899, the first work by an African-American artist to enter an American museum, Henry Oswald Tanner's Annunciation, was acquired, and in 1906, Johnson ensured that Philadelphia would be the first city to have a painting by Mary Cassatt in its museum. The Willstack collection purchases, though, sometimes mirrored Johnson's own in artist and subjects. For instance, he bought 2 crucifixions attributed to El Greco, one for himself and one for Willstack. He also bought 2 sketches by John Constable of Brighton Beach, one for himself, one for Willstack. But the Willstack collection tended to lack the concentrations of his personal one and generally represented an artist by a single large painting. Despite his astute eye and acquisition of masterpieces by Roger van der Weyden, Sonderdam, or Titian, Johnson's purchases are, in hindsight, not always consistent. He missed attributions and didn't assemble a perfectly comprehensive collection. American painting and the French Rococo are notably absent, as are modern artists like Paul Cézanne. Of the latter, Johnson wrote, "Whilst the Impressionist art does not appeal very strongly to me, I recognize that this is a mere matter of individual taste, and that it does appeal very strongly to a great many connoisseurs of the highest taste and best judgment. I think it well also for any museum to have represented on its walls examples, as far as possible, of everyone who stands for something in art. Cézanne thus does stand." And so Johnson, who had been appointed a trustee of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1910, voted in favor of the New York Museum's purchase of this Cézanne from the Armory show in 1913. While Johnson had the means to acquire select and costly masterpieces, he generally shied away from expensive acquisitions and the exclusive pursuit of names. His collection was shaped by his belief that, as he wrote, a great artist is represented by those works which, being out of his ordinary style, are more likely to display his best thought. Indeed, many of Johnson's paintings are noted for their freshness, immediacy, and small scale. One suspects that getting close to the artist, his process and methods, fascinated Johnson, and might explain why he collected oil sketches by Constable and Rubens, but none of the large canvases for which each artist was renowned. Artist attributions also did not overly burden Johnson, and he even found amusement in them, commenting of a dealer's find, "Perhaps it is by Giotto, and probably it is by somebody else." While he avidly followed the art market and tracked the acquisitions of fellow collectors and clients, such as Henry Clay Frick, J. Pierpont Morgan, or P.A.B. Widener, Johnson never lost sight of art's potential for joy and delight, and he advised collectors and museums to buy according to artistic merit, beauty, and appeal. As he wrote to Robert de Forest, president of the Metropolitan Museum in 1916, "Some things are beautiful and leave us cold. Others so fill us with delight that it is almost impossible to resist the inclination to acquire them." And such was the case with his panels by Masaccio and Masolino, of which he wrote to Berenson, "The attribution may or may not be right. The paintings themselves are delightful." Although he assembled many advisors and friends in the art world, Johnson never hired someone to manage his collection, instead serving as his own curator, overseeing acquisitions, photography, publications, and the care of the artwork. His hanging style was eclectic, with visitors describing artwork hanging on every wall surface and stacked on the floor. Artist George Biddle recalled, "He had 1,100 masterpieces in a fire trap on South Broad Street. I had a ticket of admission to his house, and once, when he was not home, I poked my nose into various corners that were not commonly visited by the public. I found 2 Chardins in his boot closet, many examples of the Barbizon school in his bathroom, and Sargent's, Manet's, and French Impressionists in the corridors of the servants' stairway." While many found this display incoherent, Johnson arranged the installations according to his own taste and rationale. As an art critic recounted in 1917, he explained to me why he had placed a portrait of a woman by Jan van Ravenstein and a Salome by Henri Martin side by side. Each, he said, contributes to my appreciation of the other. He hadn't obtained either of them to serve as an exhibit in a scientifically ordered museum. He had got them both to live with, end quote. Far from being overwhelmed by the collection, Johnson had an intimate familiarity with it and knew the location of every piece. He could direct a restorer to the exact placement of a painting he wished to have cleaned, or he could instruct a servant to go upstairs to the 3rd floor back bedroom and bring us down the Botticelli picture that is leaning against the tub. Johnson regarded his collection as fodder for study, generously lending to exhibitions and embarking in 1908 on an updated collection catalog. He hired Berenson Valentiner and William Roberts to work on the Italian, Dutch and Flemish, and British sections, respectively. Johnson followed with interest their debates over attribution, expressing no disappointment when works were demoted. In 1914, when the 3-volume catalog was finally published, he sent copies to scholars, collectors, and dealers, retaining carefully, and they're in the archives that will soon be published digitally, retaining their letters, correcting, commenting, and revising on the published attributions, probably heeding his earlier statement that those of us who have been educated in art by object lessons, year after year, have seen the old idols fall and new ones arise. In the last decade of his life, Sundays were spent with a collection, as a friend recounted. Sunday by Sunday, a chosen group of guests came to him. New acquisitions were propped up in a convenient chair and discussed in all lights. Old favorites were plucked out of serried rows of pictures stacked up against the wall. Racy anecdotes of the picture quest were recounted. There was a look-along luncheon. Great people and enthusiastic nobodies were thus welcomed. There was an unfailing influx of European visitants, great dealers, collectors, experts, mere political or literary celebrities. There was abundant good talk and equal opportunity for silent converse with the masterpieces, quaintly crowded on the walls and on the very doors. End quote. The collection occupied the non-working moments of Johnson's life, but how did he intend for it to be used and appreciated after his death? His habitual reserve clings to this topic as well. In his will, he wrote, "The leisure moments of my life have been spent making this collection. I have lived my life in this city. I want the collection to have its home here." And beginning in 1898, there were hints that his collection would be given to the city. In 1906, he proposed to fellow members of the Memorial Hall Committee of the Fairmount Park Commission that his collection be combined with those of William Elkins, P.A.B. Widener, and William Wilstack into a single art gallery that would make Philadelphia the art center of America and the rival of many European cities. Johnson favored a site within the center of the city so that the gallery would be available to all classes of citizens, and he even identified the site at Broad and Pine Streets, which was then occupied by the School of Industrial Art. But nothing happened very swiftly, as it tends not to, or certainly didn't in Philadelphia politics at that time. And in 1917, perhaps out of despair or necessity, since there was as yet no suitable municipal art museum, Johnson opted to keep his collection in his home at 510 South Broad Street. He'd moved to this address in 1915, seeking an additional floor and better light for the collection. In abandoning the ideal of a municipal art museum housing a collection of collections, and instead creating a house museum, Johnson was, of course, following the model of many other American collectors, such as Isabella Stewart Gardner, the Walters, Frick himself, and even George Blumenthal. He must have trusted that the collection's diversity, size, and unique character would ensure its acclaim, and that generations of visitors, scholars, curators, and conservators would share his sentiment that art gives us real delight only when the eye derives pleasure from that which is really worthy. Thank you.